my role of headship is not an overbearing, demanding, oppressive leadership. No, it's a selfless, sacrificial, where I'm actually going to do what probably she wants more than even what I want, as long as it doesn't contradict the vision of our home and anything biblically or what I hear the Lord telling me. Why? Because I want to bless her, because that's my job, that she would be blessed, she would be fulfilled. You're listening to Men of Faith, the podcast dedicated to calling men up and not out. Join me as we live a life dedicated to our God. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Men of Faith podcast, where we dive deep into the heart of what it means to be a godly man in today's world. My name is Caleb, and I'm your host, and I am here with my season 1 co-host, Brandon Miller, once again.
Caleb, great to see you.
You too, man. And I just want to say, where are my MOFs at?
MOFs.
I know you're watching. That's the Men of Faith. It's new, but we already like it, so we're rocking with it, Brandon.
I like it too. Yeah, it's good. Men of Faith. If you listen to the last episode, brothers, we talked about getting you a band of brothers. 1 Corinthians 16, 13 to 14. Hopefully you put that somewhere where you were seeing that, standing firm, being a man of faith, man of God. That was a good session and good episode, and here we are, episode 2.
So I wanted to kind of piggyback and continue on that last conversation, but shifting gears a bit on this idea of not just manhood and biblical manhood, but to really talk about masculinity as a whole, this topic of masculinity, and really addressing, I would say, what has become a buzzword or a buzz phrase in today's culture, which is the idea of toxic masculinity. So we're hearing it thrown out all the time, Brandon. Oh, that's toxic masculinity. Oh, there's so much toxic masculinity in the church. There's toxic masculinity in the workplace. Like, I'm hearing this term, and I think there's a lot of confusion around it. I think as a man, I just kind of, to be honest, tune it out. I go, yeah, okay, because it doesn't seem like it has a clear definition. And so I think it would be good for us to talk about it, because ultimately we're hearing this. Maybe we've had this thrown in our face before. And so I want to talk about it. And I want to talk about by starting and saying first that if something is true masculinity, which I think is healthy, right? Because there can be unhealthy masculinity, but ultimately, if it's true masculinity, and especially if it's biblical masculinity, it cannot be toxic. So I want to start by saying that. I want to start by saying that toxic masculinity, to me, is a social construct of a culture that is maybe just uncomfortable with some of the biblical roles that the Bible has laid out for us as men and women. But then there has obviously been perpetrated on women in the workplace, in the church, but I wouldn't call that true masculinity. I would probably just call that toxic adulthood. I just call it toxic, unhealthy behaviors. And so I think we need to redeem this idea of masculinity and really talk about biblical masculinity and what that looks like. Because in our day and age, we're getting these terms thrown at us, and I think men are afraid to be men. And that's the last thing we want, Brandon.
That's right. At whatever point where we emasculate men and we cause men to shrink back from their responsibility, their duty to fulfill the roles in their life as a leader in their home, as a leader in their community, as a leader in their walk of faith, with their family, and to do so in a way that honors God and honors those they lead. Because as you describe toxicity, it almost always revolves back to some level of selfishness. I am self-serving in my leadership. And then folks would be right to say that is toxic behavior. Recently, someone that I have as a colleague talked about being in a relationship with a narcissist. And this person would say that they were recovering from that abusive relationship. And in a moment of vulnerability, this person shared with me what that was like. And this was a person who was abusive in speech, abusive with some level of physicality, abusive with control measures. And we could agree that is toxic behavior. That is not healthy by anyone's definition. And in this case, I was talking to a woman. If the roles had been reversed, we would still call it toxic. And yet, toxic behavior seems to always go down the path of self serving interests and then carrying my self interest out on whoever it is I'm with. I have to agree 100%. True masculinity, biblical masculinity, things like sacrifice, service, laying your life down, generosity. Like there's a whole list of ways that true masculinity comes through in that biblical narrative you're talking about.
Yeah, so I just have to push back on the term at all because I read some definitions and ultimately, it said toxic masculinity is violence by men towards women. It's creating a dysfunctional family environment by a man. It is any male dominance in any space. And then even it referred to toxic masculinity as traditional male gender roles that would pigeonhole men to only do a traditional role. That's considered toxic masculinity. And one thing that actually, I read in that, which I was like, okay, I can see why people would associate this with toxic masculinity was the idea that men can only express certain emotions like anger, but limit the emotions they can express in the construct of relationships with family or anyone. And so I get at times, I'm like, okay, I understand where you're coming out with toxic masculinity. The problem is when we start bringing things in like traditional male roles and considering that toxic. Well, that's not necessarily toxic. I mean, in fact, for thousands of years, this is how we operated as a human species, playing to our strengths, even in physicality. And now we're in a day and age where everything's changed because we're not hunting and gathering and sewing our own clothes and raising animals and plowing our own fields. It's just the world has changed. The technological revolution that we've walked through more recently. And so I watched a video, and this is what I kind of wanted to like land on, Brandon, and get some of your thoughts. And it was by a young man. He actually had young children, and he talked about the unhealth of the past in fatherhood and in male roles within the home. And so at first I was kind of rocking with it because he was talking about how fathers were not present. They were always off working, work long hours. They weren't present with their children. They weren't present in the home. They weren't present with their spouse. They came home completely exhausted, had nothing they could give to their children, their wife, and then repeated the same thing the next day, right? Back to work, long hours, nothing to give emotionally. There was no nurturing that took place. And it basically was pushing back on that and saying, this was what was modeled for us. But now there's a new generation of fathers who are not engaged in this toxic masculinity and are nurturers. They're nurturing their children. They're more present. They're involved in household chores. They share the household chores with their wife. And so for a little bit, I was like, okay, I'm rocking with this. Like, yes, things have changed culturally because of even how we work and that women are working now just as much. And it's a good thing that we're doing things alongside of our spouse and we're present emotionally for our children. But then all of a sudden it kind of shifted to elevating women to actually take on the role that men used to have. And it was pushing that men should now be nurturers and stay home. And now women should actually be out working. And we need a new generation of dads. And basically, it was proliferating the same exact negativity of the past, but just reversed. But it was okay because now women are doing it and it's women's empowerment and we're breaking off toxic masculinity. And then I was like, no, this is a contradiction. This is hypocritical. I wanted to talk about that in the context of toxic masculinity and even like, what do you think it looks like health in the home today?
It's very interesting, that narrative. If you follow that narrative that you're talking about there, And in the first few examples, it's talking about men abdicating their roles to lead in the home, to serve and serve by loving, investing, caring for, being present, being a part of the process, teaching, modeling. I'm part of an organization called Front Row Dads, and the whole organization, the emphasis is on being dads first, be family men first, and then your life, your business, your other stuff. And I would say God first. And then, my role as a husband and father are premium roles that I'm called to, meaning these are things that the scripture makes it really clear. And so it's interesting the way that video goes from an abdicating of responsibility to a different form of abdicating responsibility. And it's almost that circular logic that just keeps circling back on itself, because now we're exchanging one set of circumstances where a dad wasn't present to do his role to now I'm putting upon my wife. Now, if in your home, it's the choice that you as a couple made for your wife to work and you to take on other responsibilities, I can't tell you how that should go, right? I mean, we can't infer, because what if she landed the killer job? What if she's got the PhD? What if she's got, all this and we had kids and now we got to figure this out? But to say that's a way to restore or almost a recompense for what was done in the past, this is how we pay. I think now we're moving out of what we were describing in episode 1, being a biblical man of faith.
I agree 100%. Here's what I thought was interesting. Like, I do think there's a movement of men who are nurturers. And forever, we didn't nurture, right? As men, we did not nurture our children. That was our wife's job, the woman's job. I mean, I'm just saying culturally, that's how it was for, I would say, thousands of years. And so I do think there's something good about being a nurturer, and that as men, we should learn to be nurturing as well. And there's something healthy to that. But here's what I think is interesting, because I see a lot of these videos on Instagram, social media. It seems like the people that have the most to say are also the earliest in the journey. Like, oh, you're advocating for nurturing as men and husbands, but your children are 2, 3 years old. They're a baby. In that time frame, we do more nurturing, and we need men to nurture their children more than they have in the past, and probably even we experienced. But then the time comes where they're no longer little babies. They're now becoming young people and then young adults, adolescents. The nurturing has to be put to the side. There's still an aspect of it, but now that comes a time like I have to discipline, right? I have to coach. I have to guide. Sometimes I have to drop the hammer, so to say, because they are not learning correctly on their own. And it's my job to protect them and to guide them, to prepare them for the world ahead of them. And so I think it's interesting that there's this push as a pushback on toxic masculinity, which again, I don't even think is real in truth, because biblical masculinity and healthy masculinity can never be toxic. There's this push towards a reversal of roles, but not only that, that men would just become nurturers, and that's not even how God designed us. And you can call me a traditionalist. Women nurture by nature. Men, we can do it. And I did it when my children were little. But then the time comes, I'm naturally a better disciplinarian, coach. I'm just better at that naturally. And I think we need to embrace that and not see it as toxic masculinity. Just nurture. Yeah, let me tell you what you get when you have a bunch of children who are only nurtured their whole lives.
I think we both agree, and anyone listening would say that list you started with on toxic masculinity, violent, dysfunctional, dominant, these behaviors. I think anyone would say that's dysfunctional, whichever source it's coming from. When you treat people like that, it's wrong. And yet to take the stereotype of a gender and say, well, if you hold to traditional values of leadership, stewardship, the responsibility, as you just described, to enforce policies, if you will, rules, take the hard steps and have difficult conversations that require restriction of whether that's a budget in the couple or behavior in the child. This is hard stuff. And no one of us does it right. I grew up in an era, Caleb, and you probably had some of this, where when I did wrong, I got to hear my dad's belt come flopping out of his pants. And I lived in a time when that was really effective because the memory of that discipline said, hey, if I do that behavior, I get this outcome. And we could debate all day whether corporal punishment has its place, but it worked. It's very effective. Recently, I dealt with a situation with one of my many kids. I have 7 of them, so I won't call anybody out, but there was a behavior that needed to be addressed. This behavior had to do with, we'll say, taking something that doesn't belong to you that belonged to someone else. And when this behavior occurred, it came to light. And what it did, I was able to share with this child that, when I was younger, I had a similar thing happen where I had this come to light as well. I took something that didn't belong to me. And what my parents did for me was let me experience the consequence by having to go to the sheriff office, have to be interviewed there, have to see the reality of what happens in this. And guess what? I didn't do it again. I decided that's not worth it. One of my kids' eyes got big as saucers. And this thought is going through their head. Are you going to call the cops on me? Are you going to call the cops on me? And so I didn't find out till later that when I said, okay, go away now, I got to talk to your mom about this. We got to debate this. He went to talk to one of the other siblings, and then the conversation grew to, I think they're about to do it. I think someone's about to come to the door. And there was a real serious consequence to that kind of behavior. But if my child does not learn hard things, hard ways, what am I doing for him? And if that means that's toxic, I would not agree. I would say that's actually healthy. That's necessary because in the real world, there's going to be real consequences.
You and I probably both had the same experience. I got a lot of whoopings as a child, belt, paddle. We had a paddle with holes in it, wooden paddle. And I definitely did spank my children, but very few occasions, much less than my parents did. And so I think that there is a challenge within this, is what I want to get back to, of healthy masculinity, biblical masculinity, and our role as men in a culture that tells us any traditional role is toxic. And the reality is the Bible has traditional values. Ephesians 5 tells us that the husband is the head of the household and the head of the wife, and actually calls her the weaker vessel. I know women aren't going to like this one, potentially, but this is how the Bible defines us, our roles. But it goes on and says, what does headship look like? What does it mean to be the head of the household, the head of our wives and our homes? Well, it means you love your wife the way Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it. It is a call to sacrificial, selfless, denial of self leadership. And that's where I think, to be honest, if I was ever to be like, yeah, there's toxic masculinity, the only time I see it in the church is when men are just telling their wives to submit. And I have a big issue with men who use this scripture to lower their wives, to elevate themselves, to put them in their place and say, well, the Bible says you need to submit and I'm the head. And I always say it. In 16 years of marriage, I've never had to tell my wife to submit, because if I'm leading the way I'm supposed to, the way Jesus led, selflessly, sacrificial, I won't have to say that to her because she'll naturally do it because she can trust me to lead her. And my wife tells people all the time, like, I do yield to Caleb as the head of our household, the head of our church, the head of our home. And I see myself, because these are the roles that the Bible gave us, in that role of underneath him. But my role of headship is not an overbearing, demanding, oppressive leadership. No, it's a selfless, sacrificial, where I'm actually going to do what probably she wants more than even what I want, as long as it doesn't contradict the vision of our home and anything biblically or what I hear the Lord telling me. Why? Because I want to bless her, because that's my job, that she would be blessed, she would be fulfilled, she would be healthy. And so that's the selfless, sacrificial love that I think we have to live out. So that's the only toxicity I see when it comes to biblical manhood, is us getting sucked into the unhealthy use of even the Bible to oppress and subjugate our wives, our women, to us, rather than leading them selflessly and sacrificially the way Jesus did.
As I'm listening to Caleb, I heard that when we're serving, when we are selfless, when we're sacrificing, when we're supporting, we are operating in biblical masculinity. And I'll tell you, as someone who very much had occasion in my marriage where I operated outside of those lines. Believe it or not, Caleb, there were times I wanted to get my way with my wife, and I used means that were not those four things. I could raise my voice. I could stress my physicality. I could create a space where my wife might feel inferior, either by tone, posture. And all I got back for that was a distance of relationship. All I created was a barrier to trust, because my wife, more than anything, wants to trust me because she wants to see me receiving from Jesus all of those things that he gives me that she wants in return. And in that space, when there is service, selflessness, sacrificial love, and true support, we want to talk about followership. You want to talk about encouragement. You want to talk about strengthening, but it's hard. What's being put out here today, just know the default path of lead for me. I know some of our friends today listening, they may not be married yet, right? They might be in a relationship with someone. They might be looking for that relationship wherever they are at. Maybe they're post a relationship and looking for another one. That practice you can do right now, right? What does it look like to be selfless at work? What does it look like to serve others? What does it look like to show up in that true masculinity, that true essence of being a man?
It comes down to, are we going to be like Jesus or not? By default, we are selfish. We don't want to be like Jesus. Like, our natural bent is not to be selfless, sacrificial, and put others before ourselves. Our natural default is me, myself, and I. How can I gratify my feelings, my wants, my desires? And so you're right that if you're single, you need to start learning and practicing that now by serving, by loving others well, serving in the church, serving people at work, serving your family. And here's what I would say. I think sometimes guys think if I live this way, I'm not going to ever get anything I want, though. And this is the lie that the enemy proliferates. When I serve Chrissy, my wife, and I'm selfless and I'm sacrificial, it comes back to me so much more and with so much more blessing and favor than when I try to meet my own needs before hers. We'll talk about sex and how this plays out too, Brandon. We'll get there one of these weeks. But I'm in the 16th year of marriage, the best year of marriage probably I've ever had. And I feel like my wife is blessing and serving me more than ever. It took me several years to realize it was because I've become more selfless and sacrificial too. It's crazy how when we live that way, they in turn begin to live that way. That's what leadership looks like.
I want to drop a quote because even people in the realm of business know this, right? So the late great Zig Ziglar has a really famous quote. And I heard this back in the days when I was learning business development, learning how to grow business. And it is, you can have everything in life you want if you will just help other people get what they want. Zig Ziglar was a man of God and had a deep and abiding faith in Jesus, and yet was very successful in his business career. And his whole point was, if you're in it for just me, you will be found out. People will find out that you were in it for you, and they will not want to stay engaged with you. By and large, that is not going to work over the arc of time. People will pull away from selfish people every single time. But when you work and you truly think about other people and how you serve, you support everything that is being brought out in marriage, it works in your career. It works in your friendships. It works in your areas of service because you're truly saying, how do I help you reach your mark? How do I help you get there? And I think everything we're going to say is going to boil back to be like Jesus. But this one, I'll tell you, as a person who does business development for my company, I sell. And when I go into the sell, I have found there is nothing more powerful than when I take the posture of service. How can I serve and support that problem you need to solve, this situation? It's not foolproof. People aren't always lining up to buy what I sell, but I'll tell you what, it works more often than it doesn't. and it works really well for return business. So this is a concept, Caleb, that we're bringing out, that even whether you're talking in the home, when you're talking in life, in business, friendships, it works, man. These concepts are powerful.
So that's the call up today. I think the call up is that we would call us to a place of selflessness and service. And so I think single people out there listening, you need to begin thinking, my call up is, what can I do this week to serve someone in my life? Serve at my job, serve in my church, serve someone in my family. Husbands, the call up for you is, how can you serve your spouse this week? What is something that you know, if you selflessly laid down even your desires and served in a way that you know she's been wanting, asking, and would fill her love tank, what can you do this week for your spouse, for your children? Because that's what headship looks like. That's what leading and this biblical role of headship as a man looks like. And this is what I believe biblical manhood looks like. So as followers of Christ, we live healthy biblical masculinity, and it looks like servanthood. So that's your call up today, ladies and gentlemen, but really the gentlemen. So our MOFs out there, thank you for listening. Episode 2, Brandon, it's been a pleasure. Continue to listen, Spotify, iTunes podcasts, also on our YouTube channel. And then for all the up-to-date notes, videos, to know when things are coming out, make sure you follow our Instagram, Men of Faith Pod. That's Men of Faith Pod, and that'll let you know everything that's happening in this MOF world. Thanks for listening, guys. We pray that you've been called up today and you step into what is biblical, healthy men of faith lifestyles. So, hey, we love you guys. Peace. Thanks for listening to Men of Faith. If you got questions you'd like us to talk about on the show, we'd love to hear from you. Join the conversation by reaching out in the Facebook group, and we will definitely add it to our list. Also, if you want to engage with us at any of our quarterly men's events, you can check out projectchurch.com for more information. Until next time, grace and peace.